Good afternoon, welcome to This Week in Turkey. A bomb attack claimed by the Islamic State killed 2 US soldiers and 2 civilians working for the US military in northern Syria in the city of Manbij on Wednesday.
The attack, which killed at least 15 other people in the city of Manbij, came weeks after US President Donald Trump said the group had been defeated and that he would pull out all American forces. The American deaths included 2 US service members, a defense contractor, and a Department of Defense civilian. Prior to Wednesday's attack, only 2 US service members had been killed in action in Syria since the start of the campaign in 2014. A witness in Manbij said Wednesday's attack had targeted a restaurant where US personnel were meeting members of the militia backed by Washington. The US military's Central Command said that the attack happened while conducting a local engagement in Manbij. An ISIS statement later said a Syrian fighter had detonated his explosive vest on a foreign patrol in the city. Hours after the blast, US Vice President Mike Pence said he and Trump condemned the attack. He simultaneously restated US plans to withdraw while also saying Washington would never allow Islamic State to re-establish itself. Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan said he did not believe the attack would have an impact on the US decision to withdraw from Syria. The US has about 2,000 troops in Syria, with no specific date for their withdrawal. Last week, the US began withdrawing some military ground equipment from Syria, according to an administration official with direct knowledge of the operation.
Joining us today to talk about the future of the relations between Ankara and Damascus is Hasan Ünal, who is a professor of political science and international relations at Maltepe University. Good afternoon, Professor Ünal. Welcome to This Week in Turkey.
Good afternoon.
So before we start talking about the future of Turkey's relations with the Syrian government, let's take a look at its past. What can you tell our viewers about the trajectory of Turkey's relations with the Syrian government up until the civil war?
Well, I think we've got to divide the long period from the emergence of Syria after the end of the Second World War as an independent state, right up to the civil war that broke out in 2011. So we've got to divide that period into two. So from the independence of Syria right up to 1998, which is when a diplomatic and military crisis basically initiated by Turkey, which resulted in an overall memorandum and understanding between the two capitals about a number of standing issues, particularly serious support for the PKK terrorist organization. Until then, Turkey's relations with Syria were never easy. Although Turkey, for instance, from 1964 to 1980s, improved its relations, its ties to all the Arab countries in the region, as it revised its policy in 1964 as a result of the Johnson letters' arrival in Ankara. Relations between Ankara and Damascus were always uneasy. And this basically the situation became even worse, particularly in late 1970s and 80s, as the Damascus government began to actively and openly support the PKK terrorist organization against Turkey. But this period came to an abrupt end in 1988 with the diplomatic political crisis which Ankara initiated. And it also resulted in the signing of a memorandum which is known in the recent political history of Ankara-Damascus relations, Adana Memorandum. According to that memorandum, the Damascus government promised a totally hands-off policy of PKK. It also promised not to offer any support to any terrorist organizations on its soil, any terrorist organization that might be doing anything terrorist against Ankara, against Turkey, basically. And what I would say that the Syrian government remained quite loyal to the letter and the spirit of that memorandum from 1988 right up to 2011. For about 13 years, the Syrian government basically did not basically get involved with either PKK or any offshoot of that terrorist organization in any conspiracy against Turkey, let alone do that. Basically, the Syrian government was quite friendly. It improved its ties to Turkey. In the first 5 years, right up to the present government came to power in Ankara, and then together with the present government from 2003 right up to 2011 for about 8 years, the relations were extremely exemplary, given that the two governments appeared to be working quite closely on a variety of matters, and then there were also how shall I say, exemplary moments where and when you would have the Turkish government, the cabinet, the Turkish cabinet and the Syrian cabinet having joint meetings, and then cabinet members basically talking about possibilities of cooperation on a variety of matters. So basically, by the time Turkey turned against Syria in 2011, as part of a sudden change of heart, which hadn't been explained to the Turkish public, Turkey basically turned against a very friendly government. Friendly, almost like an ally, because Syria was also not only listening to what Turkey had to say about all the political matters involving the Middle East in particular, but the Syrians in particular were quite prepared to act together with Turkey on all matters of importance in the region. And this was totally out of order as far as I'm concerned on the part of the Turkish government. The Turkish government, would have certain advice to offer to the Syrian government on certain matters, but then it turned into a question of sort of dictating its will to the Syrian government, and in a way that no independent government would ever accept. And that resulted in a sudden deterioration of relations between the two countries. And the Syrians, the fact that the Syrians shot down a Turkish warplane, claiming that it had sort of violated their airspace slightly, also exacerbated the worsening relations. And then this is where we are now. Basically, over the last 8 years or so, the situation has gone from bad to worse. Now, I would say that it is high time that we had to reconciliate. There has to be some sort of reconciliation between the two governments for stability and security in the wider region.
We will get to the question of reconciliation, Professor Ünal, but before we do that, let's shift our focus from the past, which you have explained briefly, and let's get to what's happening today, at present. So a widespread view holds that after the US military withdrawal from Syria, Kurds of northern Syria will have to establish friendly ties with the Bashar Assad government. Would you agree with this kind of a view?
Which government said that? You mean Russia?
This is a widespread view nowadays that's going around. This view holds that Kurds will have to re-establish ties with the Assad government. Would you agree?
You mean Turkey?
Kurds of northern Syria.
Oh, okay, I got it. Yeah, no. Well, when you say Kurds of northern Syria, you've got to be careful about the wording. Basically, this has become, being omnipresent in the Western newspapers, in particular in the English language, and also French language newspapers and others, that it is Syrian Kurds versus Turkey, or Turkey versus Syrian Kurds. There is no such thing. Basically, what Turkey is against in Syria is the YPG organization, which is an offshoot of the PKK, which is a terrorist organization And the United States and its allies recognize PKK as a terrorist organization. Over the years, particularly as a result of the ISIS threat to the region, to the wider region, the United States and its allies basically supported the YPG and PYD. So, to our understanding, PKK quite overtly in order to curb the area of activity of ISIS. Now, when you say the Syrian Kurds and the Syrian government, yes, as far as ordinary Kurdish people are concerned, of course, like all the sections of the Syrian society, Arabs, Kurds, Turkomans, ethnically speaking, or Alawites, Sunnis, Dursis, and others, speaking in terms of in sectarian terms, have got to be under Syrian control. In other words, Syria should have to establish its sovereignty over all its territories, and including northern Syria, including those parts to the east of Euphrates, and also Idlib, plus all those territories that are currently under Turkey and the Free Syrian Army. In other words, Syria basically should be re-established, should be reset up on the basis of its constitutional framework, that is a nation state on a unitary basis. And it's got to come about almost like that once again. That is in the interest of Turkey, and that is also in the interest of the wider Middle East.
Professor Ünal, let's get to the issue of reconciliation now, as you have mentioned briefly in one of your previous responses. So Erdogan has been against Assad from the very early days of the war, and he has subscribed very enthusiastically, actually, to the Assad must go camp of this conflict. But time has shown that Assad is in fact here to stay. So how can the wounds be healed between Ankara and Damascus if there in fact is a reconciliation in the cards?
Well, that's a very good question, I think. How can the wounds be basically healed, given that both Erdogan and Assad are in power? And what would you do about it? Yes, on the one hand, you can say, well, yes, it's a difficult situation. But on the other, sober-mindedness basically would triumph over everything else as far as states and their foreign relations are concerned. I would give you an example. For instance, Saudi Arabia and its close allies in the Gulf have fostered, organized, and supplied a number of so-called jihadist organizations against the Syrian government. They caused havoc across Syria. And the Syrian government, some 6 months ago or less, basically stated that the Saudis and their Gulf Arab states spent about $137 billion in order, basically, they have lavishly spent that money into that Syrian war with a view to toppling the Syrian government. But they have been totally unsuccessful. And when they realized that they could not do it, now they are coming round to the view that, as you said, the Syrian government is there, and Assad is also there, and they would have to reconcile to that. And now, Gulf Arab countries, some of them have already opened their embassies in Damascus, and it is expected that Saudi Arabia is also going to reestablish its diplomatic ties back to Damascus, including Egypt, which has been a close ally of Saudi Arabia in fighting Ikhwan al-Muslimin in particular across the Middle East. So if they can do it, we should also be able to do it. And the other example would be the Adana Memorandum of 1988. For instance, until 1988, basically Syrian governments, headed by Hafez Assad, had been a very, very big problem for all the Turkish governments in power because of their open support for the PKK. But then when the Assad government of the time backed down from their position, from its position, and said that it would be prepared to sign up a protocol promising not to extend any support to any terrorist organization on Syrian soil, and then it would also basically cooperate with Turkey in eradicating terrorism around Syria, in sort of Syrian-controlled part of Lebanon. And then as the Syrian government remained loyal to all its promises, then the Adana Memorandum basically created a very, very positive atmosphere between the two countries. So how could that be done? Well, I would give you these examples. Don't forget, states are very creative political actors when they act in a sober-minded way, and normally states are very, what basically motivates states in their foreign policy is their interests. And when it comes to interests, basically I would clearly say that it is certainly in Turkey's interest to warm up to Syrian government, and it is also in Syrian government's interest to warm up to Turkey. So basically, as the conditions dictate these days, then this has got to be done. You know, it is not a question of whether you like somebody or not. The states don't get motivated by like or dislike, hate or what have you. They just get motivated into action for interest.
And finally, Professor Ünal, how do you think the Syrian government, the Syrian side of this scenario would behave if Ankara was, in fact, to reconcile with Damascus? In other words, would Assad be willing to work with Erdogan?
Well, I suppose the short answer to that would be yes. But then you would ask the question, until what time would the Assad government basically be prepared to reconcile to Turkey, and under what circumstances? I would say for the time being, yes. Over the last few years, it had been, the Syrian side has shown its willingness to basically reconcile for any reconciliation with Turkey. And last year, on more than one occasion, the Damascus government again gave out its positive indications that it would be prepared for a reconciliation with Ankara. But then now, for instance, on the basis of what, for instance, would Damascus government be prepared for a reconciliation with Ankara? Well, basically, a reconciliation with Ankara would give Damascus control over all its territories that are under Turkey's control now. Otherwise, it might become problematic, okay, trying to stick to those territories by Turkey would also be a headache for Turkey in the years ahead, given the international politics and given the fact that the Syrian government has taken the upper hand in the fighting, and it's established its sovereignty over much of its territories. But still, it would be much easier and much less problematic for Syria to establish its control over, say, Idlib, over the Turkish-controlled territories, plus to all those territories to the east of Euphrates. But then, if Turkey basically sticks to its guns and then says, no, I don't want any reconciliation with the present government in Syria, And I'll basically press ahead with my own agenda of setting up a security zone along the Turkish borders, or I will go into, say, northeast Syria and quite deeply, and then try to control all those territories to the east of the Euphrates, and keep those territories under my control or through my proxy Syrian Free Syrian Army and all that, then that would be a recipe for disaster, basically, between the two countries. And alternatively, if Syria basically gets control of those regions, including Idlib, and then the only remaining part, which is not under control of Syria, being the Turkish-controlled territories, then Syria would have much less lure for any reconciliation with Ankara. Instead, Syria would simply say, well, all the foreign forces would have to get out of Syria. If by that stage the United States pull out of Syria, is also complete. So basically, in a sense, there is a timetable, roughly, for a reconciliation. So under the present circumstances, it is in the interest of both. But if, as I say, Turkey basically sticks to its policy, to its current policy, with no revision of that, then and as I say, Syria establishes its control over much of its territories, then Syria would have much less appetite for reconciliation.
Thank you very much, Professor Ünal, for being with us today and for your comments.
You're welcome.
Today, we were joined by Professor Hasan Ünal, who answered our questions on the possibility of a reconciliation between the Turkish government and the Assad government in Syria. And now we'll continue with our next news video. US President Donald Trump has threatened to devastate Turkey economically if it attacks Kurdish forces in Syria following a planned pullout of the US troops.
In 2 tweets on Sunday, Trump said that he did not want the Kurds to provoke Turkey either. He also said any remaining Islamic State militants could be attacked from the air and that a 20-mile safe zone could be established. Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, meanwhile, has dismissed Trump's threats. We have said multiple times that we will not fear or be deterred by any threat. You can get nowhere by threatening Turkey economically, he said. He also criticized Trump's methods, saying strategic alliances should not be discussed over Twitter or social media. Presidential spokesperson Ibrahim Kalın said Turkey expected the US to honor our strategic partnership. Terrorists can't be your partners and allies, he said. It is a fatal mistake to equate Syrian Kurds with the PKK, which is on the US terrorist list, and its Syria branch, PYD-YPG, Kalın also said on Twitter. This tweet has saddened us. Why? Because we are strategic partners. We may have different positions on some issues, but we should be locked on the same objectives, President Erdogan said on the issue. Meanwhile, speaking in Riyadh, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said he did not think Trump's threat would change plans to withdraw troops from Syria. Asked what Trump meant by economic devastation, he said, "You'll have to ask the president." On the other hand, Erdogan and Trump spoke over the phone on Monday to discuss recent developments in Syria in light of the Trump's tweets, which irked Ankara because the US had conflated Kurds with the YPG. They also discussed the idea of forming a terror-free safe zone in the north of Syria on the basis of Syria's territorial integrity. President Erdogan's spokesperson Ibrahim Kalın said at a press conference on Tuesday that the issues of economic threats have been left behind, as they were concluded nicely during the phone call between Erdogan and Trump. Turkey deems the PYD-YPG, backed by the US against the Islamic State, as an offshoot of the PKK. The PKK is listed as a terrorist organization by Turkey, the US, and the EU.
Our friend Murat Aksoy did an interview this week with main opposition Republican People's Party, CHP deputy, and former ambassador Ünal Çeviköz about the future of Turkey-Syria relations.
My view is that the cutting off of the dialogue between Turkey and Syria in mid-2012 was a wrong decision. I therefore think that Turkey should enter into a dialogue with the Syrian government as soon as possible and communicate to the Syrian government its views and stance on Syria's future. This is important because it looks like the existing government will go on after the Geneva peace talks reach an end. Even the Arab League is getting ready to re-accept Syria as a member. Some Middle Eastern countries, such as the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, are also undertaking preparations to reopen their embassies in Syria. Even Italy has declared that it will recontinue the operations in its embassy in Damascus. On the other hand, the predominant view in the international arena right now is that the conflict in the country's civil war has died down to a great extent, that Assad is there to stay, and that it is necessary to talk to Assad's regime about Syria's future. When we look at it as a whole, the only country who hasn't toned down on its Assad must go position remains to be Turkey. When circumstances change tomorrow, we will continue living as neighbors with Syria since we cannot change our geographical location. For that reason, we need to start talking to Syria again to heal the wounds in our relationship.
And joining us now is Murat Utku and Edgar Şar, who will be reporting live from Denizli and Mersin to share their impressions of these two provinces in the run-up to the March 31st local elections. Good afternoon, Murat and Edgar. Can you hear me?
Yeah, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So let's start with you, Murat. You've been going around Denizli today trying to get a feel of how the locals are likely to vote in the upcoming March 31st local elections. Can you start by telling us who's running for mayor in Denizli? Who are the big names and what do the voters think? What are your impressions?
There are two main parties, two alliances actually are now in the race for the upcoming March elections, for the local elections. We can say the AKP, the ruling party, had the alliance with MHP, the Nationalist Party here, as they do all around the country. And here they are just going to present Osman Zolan, the existing mayor of the city for the last two terms. He got the office, but now the E-Party and the CHP has another alliance, and they're having Ümit Bahtiyar as the candidate for the mayor of office of mayor in Denizli. The main thing here is, as we talk to the people of the city, they are just having some question marks in their minds, saying that, you know, the new candidate, Ümit Bahtiyar, is mainly a member of E-Party. So if the CHP voters are going to vote for E-Party, which is a central right party, separated from the Nationalist Party, so is there going to be any conflict between the two parties' voters? So this is going to be the main question. But when we ask to the CHP, both members, other candidates, and also the voters for CHP, they're saying that they are just going to give their votes, whereas the CHP and the E-Party had the alliance. So politically, they have, yes, question marks in their minds, but you know, they seem a little bit determined to give the votes for the alliance. One more thing, the most important thing, as the CHP members and the voters are saying to us, that they are going to be voting for the alliance candidate because the main aim, the main objective for them to just tackle down, to just let the AKP mayor down from the office. That's the main idea if the CHP members are going to vote for him.
Thank you very much, Murat. And over to you now, Edgar. You're in Mersin currently. You've been going around the city all day trying to get a feel of what's happening over there. So can you tell us who the mayoral candidates are and what does the city think ahead of the upcoming elections?
Well, thank you for having me. Actually, the situation here in Mersin is at least as complicated as it seems from the studio in Istanbul. because, you know, we have been going around many points in Mersin for quite a long time, actually. But unlike in Denizli, here, it's not the alliances that are running for mayor against each other, but only the people alliance between the MHP and the ruling AKP could be constructed here with the candidacy of Hamit Tuna, the sitting mayor of a smaller province in Mersin, Toroslar. And actually he has quite a chance, he has quite a shot of being elected as a mayor in the upcoming local elections, if he will be able to get the entire support of the MHP and the AKP voters. But just like in Denizli, there are also some question marks here, because the sitting mayor of Mersin will be running from E Party this time, although he was quite a member of MHP, and he was elected as mayor, as the nominee of MHP previously in 2014 elections, Burhanettin Koçamaz. But now he will running for E Party, and that's why the alliance between E Party and the CHP, Social Democratic Republican People's Party, couldn't be constructed here. But still, the CHP's nominee for mayor, Vahap Seçer, who was an MP in the parliament for 2 terms, has a shot of being elected in the local elections, because he will likely get the support of Kurdish HDP voters here in the province and also in the rural areas of the province. But still, MHP the HDP has some expectations from the CHP, just like a official, not an alliance, but maybe an official language, an official discourse between 2 parties, so that a togethership could be constructed between 2 parties. So if the HDP will not come up with another nominee, the CHP nominee will be able to get the support of Kurdish voters and has a shot of being elected as the mayor in March. But there are many question marks. There are many questions that should be answered in the upcoming period, and we will closely monitor the situation and will report back to you.
Thank you, Edgar. We were briefly joined today by Murat Utku and Edgar Şar, who reported live from Denizli and Mersin and shared their impressions of the voters in these cities ahead of the March 31st local elections. And we'll continue with our next news video now. The Turkish Statistical Institute announced on Tuesday that Turkey's unemployment rate has reached 11.6% in October.
The Turkish Statistical Institute announced on Tuesday that Turkey's unemployment rate in October increased by 1.3 percentage points, reaching 11.6%. In September, the unemployment rate was at 11.4%. According to the statement made by the institute, the number of unemployed people, which are aged 15 and above, increased by 501,000 to 3.8 million. According to the figures, the unemployment rate among the youth also reached 22.3%. The rate is expected to further increase during the upcoming months. Meanwhile, Turkey's calendar-adjusted industrial production dropped by 6.5% in November in comparison with the same month of the previous year. On a monthly basis, the drop in November is at 0.3%. Economists consider industrial production as a key indicator for the country's GDP growth. Thus, the figures imply a deteriorating economic growth for the last quarter of 2018. On Thursday, the Turkish Central Bank held its monetary policy meeting for January and kept the policy rate constant at 24%. The bank statement read that it will continue to use all available instruments in pursuit of price stability. The inflation rate for the month will be announced on the 30th of January.
Turkish authorities have arrested and deported Dutch journalist Ans Boersma after Dutch authorities said she was a suspect in an ongoing investigation into terrorism.
Burzma had been working in Turkey as a journalist since 2017. She recently had her press credentials renewed for 2019 to work for, among others, financial newspaper Het Financiële Dagblad. On Wednesday morning, she arrived at the immigration service where she was apprehended and told she would be deported. She tweeted on Thursday, saying she was put on a plane to the Netherlands. On her arrival, she was not arrested by Dutch police, the Justice Department said. According to Al Jazeera, the 31-year-old Burzma was not deported because of her work as a journalist. Turkish authorities said Burzma was suspected of having ties to Al-Nusra Front, which recently rebranded to become Heyet Tahriri Sham.
A commemoration event will take place in Istanbul tomorrow on the 12th anniversary of the assassination of Turkish-Armenian journalist Hrant Dink.
A mourning event will take place in Istanbul on the 12th anniversary of the assassination of Turkish-Armenian journalist Hrant Dink, the founder and chief editor of Agos, the city's Armenian weekly. The Dink commemoration event will be held on Saturday, outside the former office of Agos, the newspaper reported. The remembrance event will take place under the slogan, "We are not giving up Ahparig," which means brother in Armenian. Hrant Dink was gunned down on January 19, 2007, outside the then office of Agos. In 2011, the perpetrator, Ogun Samast, was sentenced by a juvenile court to 22 years and 10 months for the murder. After long court proceedings and appeals, however, a new probe was ultimately launched into this murder case and regarding numerous former and serving senior Turkish officials' complicity in the assassination.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 5 p.m. Goodbye.